Welcome back to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. Today I'll be discussing why China has a crumbling economy and why this is a long term economic trend going back over 40 years. China's crumbling economy originated in the 1980s when China was opening up its economy to the rest of the world by creating special economic zones and implementing the one child policy, which crippled China's birth rate with social engineering. China did this due to the communist philosophy, which enabled the state to interfere in individual lives due to the belief that collectivism comes before the individual. One of the critical battles during the Cold War from 1945 to 1989 was the battle between collectivism, liberalism, and economic capitalism, which saw the individual succeed, but with the collective state management controlled economy stagnate and ultimately fail. The Chinese political leadership chose to charter a third way, not communism with Chinese characteristics, but capitalism with Chinese features would be the best way to describe this. Though officially the Chinese call it, well, the Chinese Communist Party call it communism with Chinese characteristics, but that's complete and utter BS. Due to the underpinning ideology behind the Chinese Communist Party, which has proven to be wrong way to manage a nation, that is why the Chinese Communist Party only maintained its legitimacy for its economic success, not through ideological frameworks of capitalism versus communism, but due to China now being a market driven, not state driven economy since the 1980s. So the Chinese Communist Party is not actually a communist party. They're just using the name Communist Party because that's how they came to power as the Communist Party, but now they're a communist party that isn't communist. I do apologise, that's a bit confusing, but it's just how it is. Uh, at the end of the Second World War, the global population was at 2.3 billion. By 1980, it was over 4.4 billion. This marked the doubling of the world's population, with the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964. This led to the growing fear in economics and academia communities that humanity would experience global famine, mass starvation, which, in order to be prevented, which was prevented through the use of genetically engineered crops and improved technologies. The Chinese Communist Party had information from the 1960s, 70s, and 1950s. They were heading towards mass famine and that the globe was not built to sustain a population of over 7 billion. Now the population is over 8 billion. They were also heavily influenced by views of eugenics and communist ideology, but from the viewpoint of the state intervention, its people lives, China, from starvation, that's why they had to intervene from their point of view. These fears were ultimately unfounded and were essentially to understanding in the 1950s, 1970s where the political leadership was actually coming from, because that was the prominent political view at the time. It was the ideology at the time that something needed to be done. And also in the 1970s, there was the fear of global cooling, but now there's the fear of global warming, because each generation wants to think that they're living in special times. They want to believe that they're special, that they're doing something meaningful. But to be honest, that tends not to be true, particularly in the Western nations as well, because we've been at peace for nearly 80 years. So we want to believe that we are special, which we're not. Uh, in the early 1980s, China began the process under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping to open up the Chinese economy to foreign investment and begin developing a sophisticated market-based economic system for China, who was still being loosely controlled and monitored by the Chinese state. China implemented this strategy because economics in the Far East was heavily influenced by attitudes exported from Japan, particularly in the reindustrialization and destruction and its defeat in World War II. Also, Japan industrialized in the late 19th century, conquered Korea and large chunks of China, which was only possible through state intervention using debt to finance and grow the Japanese economy. Furthermore, Japan has few natural resources, which drove the need for the state intervention and the use of debt and imperialism to expand its economy. Japan used the economy as a political end, not how the West uses it. It is purely economic tool based upon the principles of the free market. For the Japanese, they adopted the viewpoint that the economy serves political ends, but not vice versa. Deng Xiaoping, being of the began the opening of the Chinese economy to foreign investment and offshore from abroad with Hong Kong, which was still controlled by the British and the crumbling empire. It was handed over to China in 1997, marking the historic end of the British Empire. Uh, the city chosen to open up the global economy only had a population of 330,000. This was based off Hong Kong, which was tiny uh, by Chinese standards in 1980, with China becoming the first nation in 1980 with a population over 1 billion. In the 40 years since, the city of Shenzhen, that's Shezhn, opened to the rest of the global economy. Its economics exceeded that of its nearest neighbours, Hong Kong, in 2018, and the city is now one of the eighth largest cities in the world with over 13 million people. There's a significant economic and social consequence of China opening its economy and the development of cities, with 65% of its population now living in cities and 50% of its population moving to cities throughout the 1990s. This was the largest migration of people in human history and marked the turning point in China from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing industrial economy in the span of 40 years. Uh, there are two critical long-term economic impacts of this choice. China experienced 7 generations of economic development within 1 generation, and experienced the same demographic decline experienced by all other industrializations, rather than being spread out over 7 generations. This happened in 1 generation. When nations move from agriculture to industrial economy, people move to the cities, and that's when children become more of a liability and expense. In the short term, previously children were free labour on the farm, but now living in small city apartments to become a financial liability, particularly in the short term. In the long term, it's a completely different story. This is why nations, once they begin industrialization, have a collapse of decline in their birth rates. For example, in the United Kingdom, birth rate has been declining for over 7 generations. That's because industrialization started in Britain in 1769. And that means that the demographic decline was able to actually spread out over 7 generations. For Germany, it's been 5 generations. And for other nations like Japan, it's been like 1 or 2 generations when they first industrialized. So the reason why it's accelerating because the nation that's first industrialized, they've got to develop the technology, and then those nations that follow them, they just got to copy or steal what they've actually already been done before by other nations. India is another recent industrializing nation. Still behind China in terms of capacity, industrial capacity, but it still has a good birth rate, which is at replacement level at 2.5. Though some data says it's actually lower than this at 2.1 or 1.9, just depends where you get your figures from. This is an indicator of an historic trend of industrialization, which leads to the collapse of birth rates. Chinese economy is functioning is on a continuous economic input. That is the continued phenomenal growth of Chinese economy that is being powered by its industrial capacity and potential, as well as the internal factors that artificially has grown China's growth GDP. The construction the construction industry is being promoted in China due to artificially to inflate the GDP numbers, which led to 65 million homes being built in China, which is the size of the population of France. We've not actually no people live there. This inflation in the Chinese housing market could lead to an economic crash similar to the 2008 banking crisis and the mortgage crisis in 2006 2007 in the United States, which triggered the global crash. From the beginning of the recession in 2007 to its official end in 2009, real gross domestic product, that's GDP as adjusted for inflation or deflation, declined by 4.3%. Unemployment increased by 5% to 9.5% and peaked at 10% in December 2009. This is the United States. Real gross domestic product fell by 4.3% from its peak in 2007 to 2009, which declined post-war era. The biggest decline in the post-war era data from 2013. The unemployment rate, which was at 5% from December 2007, rose to 9.1. This information about the United States, how now it affected the rest of the world, and how the future crashes will be affected by China, will become unprecedented in financial history, how it will affect the global economy. Um, Chinese citizens cannot invest their savings in other assets outside of China due to capital flight restrictions made by the Chinese Communist Party, because whenever they try to lift the restrictions, Chinese citizens tried to funnel their money into foreign investments or to abroad, because even the Chinese people don't have faith in their economy. Therefore, to invest for retirement, the Chinese citizens put their money in the Chinese stock market and in housing, in property. They did this because they had no other reliable method to actually have savings. And the idea was that from the savings all going into the actual housing market, they'll be able to sell that house in order to use that money to actually retire on as well. But it's not working just because there's too many houses. That decreases the value of housing, and that's they don't have enough money to retire on. There's also not enough people in China as well, because there's not enough people. As projections were by the end of this century, China's population will go from 1.4 billion to around 500 million, and that means there'll be loads of houses going desolate, not being used. That means for as a means of retirement, housing is not a safe option, and that's true for a lot of economies as well. Because with the boomer generation dying out, and many of them not choosing to have children or not having enough children, so that's why the Chinese economy is crumbling due to inaction, the choice that the government has made over the long term. So this problem is systemic. It's over 40 years old, and at this point, there's nothing really the Chinese Communist Party can do. They can only ride out the storm and try to save what they can. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you found it enjoyable. Please don't forget to subscribe, and peace out.